Tonight is a little different. Over the course of Timeless Terrors, we've journeyed through hundreds of stories together, exploring haunted houses, forgotten tombs, strange worlds and nightmares born from the imaginations of some of the greatest writers who ever lived. But tonight is not simply another volume. Tonight's collection is a handpicked, curated selection of tales that have lingered longest in the memory. Stories chosen for their atmosphere, their originality, their power to unsettle, and their ability to capture everything Timeless Terrors is about. Mystery, dread, wonder, and the strange fascination of the unknown. Within these pages you'll encounter haunted memories, forbidden knowledge, mysterious visitors, obsessions that refuse to die, and horrors that wait patiently beyond the edges of ordinary reality. Featuring unforgettable works from Edgar Allan Poe, Lord Dunsany, Robert Bloch, and Robert W. Chambers. This special collection celebrates some of the finest tales of the uncanny, the weird, and the macabre. So dim those lights once again, settle into your favorite armchair, and leave the modern world behind for a while. Tonight we revisit a selection of stories that remind us why these authors continue to haunt our imaginations, long after the final page has been turned. And now, welcome to this special collection, Volume 14 of Timeless Terrors. Welcome back, dear listener. You're just in time now. Welcome to Timeless Terrors. Some stories are read, and some stories return. Edgar Allan Poe's Ligeia, first published in 1838, is not merely a tale of love and loss. It is a meditation on will, on the terrible possibility that the human spirit may refuse its appointed end. There are certain eyes one does not forget, certain voices that echo long after the room has fallen silent. Poe understood that. He understood devotion, and the thin, trembling veil between reverence and obsession. I once knew a woman not unlike Ligeia, brilliant, unfathomable, possessed of a presence that seemed to alter the very air around her. But that is a story for another night. For now, let us turn the page and step softly into memory, mourning, and something that may be neither. Gather round. Ligeia, written by Edgar Allan Poe, narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication 1838. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright 2026. Jonathan Dunne. And the will therein lieth, which dieth not. Who knoweth the mysteries of the will with its vigour? For God is but a great will pervading all things by nature of its intentness, save only through the weakness of his feeble will. Joseph Glanville. I cannot for my soul remember how, when, or even precisely where I first became acquainted with the Lady Ligeia. Long years have since elapsed, and my memory is feeble, through much suffering. Or perhaps I cannot now bring these points to mind, because, in truth, the character of my beloved, her rare learning, her singular yet placid cast of beauty, and the thrilling and enthralling eloquence of her low, musical language, made their way into my heart by paces so steadily and stealthily progressive that they have been unnoticed and unknown. Yet I believe that I met her first and most frequently in some large old decaying city near the Rhine. Of her family I have surely heard her speak. That it is of a remotely ancient date cannot be doubted. Ligeia. Ligeia. Buried in studies of a nature more than all else adapted to deaden impressions of the outward world, it is by that sweet word alone, by Ligeia, that I bring before mine eyes in fancy the image of her who is no more. And now, while I write, a recollection flashes upon me that I have never known the paternal name of her, who was my friend and my betrothed, and who became the partner of my studies, and finally the wife of my bosom. Was it a playful charge on the part of my Ligeia, or was it a test of my strength of affection, that I should institute no inquiries upon this point, or was it rather a caprice of my own, a wildly romantic offering on the shrine of the most passionate devotion? I but indistinctly recall the fact itself. What wonder that I have utterly forgotten the circumstances which originated or attended it. And indeed, if ever that spirit which is entitled romance, if ever she, the wan and the misty-winged Astophet of idolatrous Egypt, presided, as they tell, over marriages ill-omened, then most surely she presided over mine. There is one dear topic, however, on which my memory fails me not. It is the person of Ligeia. In stature she was tall, somewhat slender, and in her latter days even emaciated. I would in vain attempt to portray the majesty, the quiet ease of her demeanor, or the incomprehensible lightness and elasticity of her footfall. She came and departed as a shadow. I was never made aware of her entrance into my close study, save by the dear music of her low, sweet voice, as she placed her marble hand upon my shoulder. In beauty of face no maiden ever equaled her. It was the radiance of an opium dream, an airy and spirit-lifting vision more widely divine than the fantasies which hovered about the slumbering souls of the daughters of Delos. Yet her features were not of that regular mould which we have been falsely taught to worship in the classical labours of the heathen. There is no exquisite beauty, says Bacon, Lord Verulam, speaking truly of all the forms and genera of beauty, without some strangeness in the proportion. Yet, although I saw that the features of Ligeia were not of a classic regularity, although I perceived that her loveliness was indeed exquisite, and felt that there was much of strangeness pervading it, yet I have tried in vain to detect the irregularity and to trace home my own perception of the strange. I examined the contour of the lofty and pale forehead. It was faultless. How cold indeed that word when applied to a majesty so divine. The skin rivaling the purest ivory, the commanding extent and repose, the gentle prominence of the regions above the temples, and then the raven black, the glossy, the luxuriant and naturally curling tresses, setting forth the full force of the Homeric epithet, hyacinthine. I looked at the delicate outlines of the nose, and nowhere but in the graceful medallions of the Hebrews had I beheld a similar perfection. They were the same luxurious smoothness of surface, the same scarcely perceptible tendency to the aquiline, the same harmoniously curved nostrils, speaking the free spirit. I regarded the sweet mouth. Here was indeed the triumph of all things heavenly. The magnificent turn of the short upper lip, the soft, voluptuous slumber of the under, the dimples which sported and the colour which spoke, the teeth glancing back with a brilliancy almost startling, every ray of the holy light which fell upon them in her serene and placid, yet almost exultingly radiant of all smiles. I scrutinized the formation of the chin too, and here too I found the gentleness of breath, the softness and the majesty, the fullness and the spirituality of the Greek, the contour which the god Apollo revealed but in dream to Cleomenes, the son of the Athenian. And then I peered into the large eyes of Ligeia. For eyes we have no models in the remotely antique. It might have been, too, that in these eyes of my beloved lay the secret to which Lord Verulam alludes. They were, I must believe, far larger than the ordinary eyes of our own race. They were even fuller than the fullest of the gazelle eyes of the tribe of the valley of Nur-Jahad. Yet it was only at intervals, in moments of intense excitement. This peculiarity became more than slightly noticeable in Ligeia. And at such moments was her beauty. In my heated fancy thus it appeared perhaps the beauty of beings either above or apart from the earth, the beauty of the fabulous Houri of the Turk. The hue of the orbs was the most brilliant of black, and far over them hung jetty lashes of great length. The brows, slightly irregular in outline, had the same tint. The strangeness, however, which I found in the eyes, was of a nature distinct from the formation, or the colour, or the brilliancy of the natures, and must, after all, be referred to the expression. Ah, word of no meaning, behind whose vast latitude of mere sound we entrench our ignorance of so much of the spiritual. The expression of the eyes of Ligeia. How for long hours have I pondered upon it? How have I, through the whole of a midsummer night, struggled to fathom it? What was it? That something more profound than the well of Democritus, which lay far within the pupils of my beloved? What was it? I was possessed with a passion to discover. Those eyes, those large, those shining, those divine orbs, they became to me twin stars of Leda, and I to them devoutest of astrologers. There is no point among the many incomprehensible anomalies of the science of mind more thrillingly exciting than the fact, never, I believe, noticed in the schools, that in our endeavours to recall to memory something long forgotten, we often find ourselves upon the very verge of remembrance, without being able, in the end, to remember. And thus how frequently, in my intense scrutiny of Ligeia's eyes, have I felt approaching the full knowledge of their expression, felt it approaching, yet not quite be mine, and so at length entirely depart. And strange, oh strangest mystery of all, I found, in the commonest objects of the universe, a circle of analogies to that expression. I mean to say that subsequently to the period when Ligeia's beauty passed into my spirit, there dwelling as in a shrine, I derived from many existences in the material world a sentiment such as I felt always aroused within me by her large and luminous orbs. Yet not the more could I define that sentiment, or analyze, or even steadily view it. I recognized it, let me repeat, sometimes in the survey of a rapidly growing vine, in the contemplation of a moth, a butterfly, a chrysalis, a stream of running water. I have felt it in the ocean, in the falling of a meteor. I have felt it in the glances of unusually aged people. And there are one or two stars in heaven, one especially, a star of the 6th magnitude, double and changeable, to be found near the large star in Lyra, in a telescopic scrutiny of which I have been made aware of the feeling. I have been filled with it by certain sounds from stringed instruments, and not unfrequently by passages from books. Among innumerable other instances, I well remember something in a volume of Joseph Glanville, which, perhaps merely from its quaintness, who shall say, never failed to inspire me with the sentiment. And the will therein lieth, which dieth not, who knoweth the mysteries of the will with its vigour. For God is but a great will pervading all things by nature of its intentness. Man doth not yield him to the angels, nor unto death utterly, save only through the weakness of his feeble will. Length of years and subsequent reflection have enabled me to trace, indeed, some remote connection between this passage in the English moralist and a portion of the character of Ligeia. An intensity in thought, action, or speech was possibly in her a result, or at least an index, of that gigantic volition which, during our long intercourse, failed to give other and more immediate evidence of its existence. Of all the women whom I have ever known, she, the outwardly calm, the ever-placid Ligeia, was the most violently a prey to the tumultuous vultures of stern passion. And of such passion I could form no estimate, save by the miraculous expansion of those eyes, which at once so delighted and appalled me, by the almost magical melody, modulation, distinctness, and placidity of her very low voice, and by the fierce energy, rendered doubly effective by contrast with her manner of utterance, of the wild words which she habitually uttered. I have spoken of the learning of Ligeia. It was immense, such as I have never known in woman. In the classical tongues was she deeply proficient, and as far as my own acquaintance extended in regard to the modern dialects of Europe, I have never known her at fault. Indeed, upon any theme of the most admired, because simply the most abstruse of the boasted erudition of the Academy have I ever found Ligeia at fault. How singularly, how thrillingly this one point in the nature of my wife has forced itself, at this late period only, upon my attention. I said her knowledge was such as I have never known in woman, but where breathes the man who has traversed, and successfully, all the wide areas of moral, physical, and mathematical science. I saw not then what I now clearly perceive, that the acquisitions of Ligeia were gigantic, were astounding, yet I was sufficiently aware of her infinite supremacy to resign myself with a childlike confidence to her guidance through the chaotic world of metaphysical investigation, at which I was most busily occupied during the earlier years of our marriage. With how vast a triumph, with how vivid a delight, with how much of all that is ethereal in hope did I feel, as she bent over me in studies but little sought, but less known, that delicious vista by slow degrees expanding before me, down whose long, gorgeous, and all untrodden path I might at length pass onward to the goal of a wisdom too divinely precious not to be forbidden. How poignant, then, must have been the grief with which, after some years, I beheld my well-grounded expectations take wings to themselves and fly away without Ligeia. Without Ligeia I was but as a child groping benighted. Her presence, her readings alone rendered vividly luminous the many mysteries of the transcendentalism in which we were immersed. Wanting the radiant luster of her eyes, letters, lambent and golden, grew duller than Saturnian lead. And now those eyes shone less, and less frequently upon the pages over which I pored. Ligeia grew ill. The wild eyes blazed with a too glorious effulgence. The pale fingers became of the transparent waxen hue of the grave, and the blue veins upon the lofty forehead swelled and sank impetuously with the tides of the gentle emotion. I saw that she must die, and I struggled desperately in spirit with the grim Azrael. And the struggles of the passionate wife were, to my astonishment, even more energetic than my own. There had been much in her stern nature to impress me with the belief that, to her, death would have come without its terrors. But not so. Words are impotent to convey any just idea of the fierceness of resistance with which she wrestled with the shadow. I groaned in anguish at the pitiable spectacle. I would have soothed, I would have reasoned, but in the intensity of her wild desire for life, but for life, solace and reason were the uttermost folly. Yet not until the last instance, amid the most convulsive writhings of her fierce spirit, was shaken the external placidity of her demeanour. Her voice grew more gentle, grew more low, yet I would not wish to dwell upon the wild meaning of the quietly uttered words. My brain reeled as I hearkened, entranced, to a melody more than mortal, to assumptions and aspirations which mortality had never before known. That she loved me, I should not have doubted, and I might have been easily aware that in a bosom such as hers, love would have reigned no ordinary passion. But in death only was I fully impressed with the strength of her affection. For long hours, detaining my hand, would she pour out before me the overflowing of a heart whose more than passionate devotion amounted to idolatry. How I deserved to be so blessed by such confessions! How had I deserved to be so cursed with the removal of my beloved in the hour of her making them? But upon this subject I cannot bear to dilate. Let me say only that in Ligeia's more than womanly abandonment to a love, alas, all unmerited, all unworthily bestowed, I at length recognized the principle of her longing with so wildly earnest a desire for the life which was now fleeing so rapidly away. It is this wild longing, it is this eager vehemence of desire for life, but for life, that I have no power to portray, no utterance capable of expressing. At high noon of the night in which she departed, beckoning me peremptorily to her side, she bade me repeat certain phrases composed by herself not many days before. I obeyed her. They were these. Lo, 'tis a gala night within the lonesome latter years. An angel throng, bewinged, bedight in veils, and drowned in tears, sit in a theatre to see a play of hopes and fears, while the orchestra breathes fitfully the music of the spheres. Mimes in the form of God on high mutter and mumble low, and hither and thither fly. Mere puppets they who come and go at bidding of vast formless things, that shift the scenery to and fro, flapping from out their condor wings, invisible woe. That motley drama, oh be sure it shall not be forgot, with its phantom chased forevermore, by a crowd that sees it not, through a circle that ever returneth in to the self-same spot. And much of madness and more, of sin and horror, the soul of the plot. But see, amid the mimic rout, a crawling shape intrude, a blood-red thing that writhes from out the scenic solitude. It writhes, with mortal pangs the mimes become its food, and the seraphs sob at vermin fangs in human gore imbued. Out are the lights, out all, and over each quivering form the curtain, a funeral pall, comes down with the rush of a storm, and the angels, all pallid and worn, uprising, unveiling, affirm that the play is the tragedy, man, and its hero, the conqueror worm. Oh God! Half shrieked Ligeia, leaping to her feet and extending her arms aloft with a spasmodic movement as I made an end of these lines. Oh God! Oh divine Father! Shall these things be undeviatingly so? Shall this conqueror be not once conquered? Are we not part and parcel in thee, who knoweth the mysteries of the will with its vigour? Man doth not yield him to the angels, nor until death utterly, save only through the weakness of his feeble will. And now, as if exhausted with emotion, she suffered her white arms to fall, and returned solemnly to her bed of death. And as she breathed her last sighs, there came mingled with them a low murmur from her lips. I bent to them my ear, and distinguished again the concluding words of the passage in Glanville. Man doth not yield him to the angels, nor unto death utterly, save only through the weakness of his feeble will. She died, and I, crushed into the very dust with sorrow, could no longer endure the lonely desolation of my dwelling in the dim and decaying city by the Rhine. I had no lack of what the world calls wealth. Ligeia had brought me far more, very far more than ordinarily falls to the lots of mortals. After a few months, therefore, of weary and aimless wandering, I purchased and put in some repair an abbey, which I shall not name, in one of the wildest and least frequented portions of fair England. The gloomy and dreary grandeur of the building, the almost savage aspect of the domain, the many melancholy and time-honoured memories connected with both, had much in unison with the feelings of utter abandonment which had driven me into that remote and unsocial region of the country. Yet although the external abbey, with its verdant decay hanging about it, suffered but little alteration, I gave way, with a childlike perversity and perchance with a faint hope of alleviating my sorrows, to a display of more than regal magnificence within. For such follies, even in childhood, I had imbibed a taste, and now they came back to me as if in the dotage of grief. Alas, I feel how much even of incipient madness might have been discovered in the gorgeous and fantastic draperies, in the solemn carvings of Egypt, in the wild cornices and furniture, in the bedlam patterns of the carpets of tufted gold. I had become a bounden slave in the trammels of opium, and my labours and my orders had taken a colouring from my dreams. But these absurdities I must not pause to detail. Let me speak only of that one chamber, ever accursed, whither in a moment of mental alienation I led from the altar as my bride, as a successor of the unforgotten Ligeia, the fair-haired and blue-eyed Lady Rowena Trevanion of Tremaine. There is no individual portion of the architecture and decoration of that bridal chamber which is not now visibly before me. Where were the souls of the haughty family of the bride, when, through thirst of gold, they permitted to pass the threshold of an apartment so bedecked, a maiden and a daughter so beloved? I have said that I minutely remember the details of the chamber, yet I am sadly forgetful on topics of deep moment, and here there was no system, no keeping, in the fantastic display to take hold upon the memory. The room lay in a high turret of the castellated abbey, was pentagonal in shape and of capacious size. Occupying the whole southern face of the pentagon was the sole window, an immense sheet of unbroken glass from Venice, a single pane and tinted of a leaden hue, so that the rays of either the sun or moon, passing through it, fell with a ghastly lustre on the objects within. Over the upper portion of this huge window extended the trellis work of an aged vine, which clambered up the massy walls of the turret. The ceiling, of gloomy-looking oak, was excessively lofty, vaulted, and elaborately fretted with the wildest and most grotesque specimens of a semi-Gothic, semi-Druidical device. From out the most central recess of this melancholy vaulting depended by a single chain of gold with long links, a huge censer of the same metal, Saracenic in pattern, and with many perforations so contrived that there writhed in and out of them, as if endued with a serpent vitality, a continual succession of party-coloured fires, some few ottomans and golden candelabra of Eastern figure were in various stations about, and there was the couch too, bridal couch, of an Indian model, and low and sculpted of solid ebony with a pall-like canopy above. In each of the angles of the chamber stood on end a gigantic sarcophagus of black granite, from the tombs of the kings over against Luxor, with their aged lids full of immemorial sculpture. But in the draping of the apartment lay, alas, the chief fantasy of all. The lofty walls, gigantic in height, even unproportionably so, were hung from summit to foot in vast folds with a heavy and massive-looking tapestry of a material which was found alike as a carpet on the floor, as a covering for the ottomans and the ebony bed, as a canopy for the bed, and as the gorgeous volutes of the curtains which partially shaded the window. The material was the richest cloth of gold. It was spotted all over, at irregular intervals, with arabesque figures about a foot in diameter, and wrought upon the cloth in patterns of the most jetty black. But these figures partook of the true character of the arabesque only when regarded from a single point of view, by a contrivance now common, and indeed traceable to a very remote period of antiquity. They were made changeable in aspect. To one entering the room they bore the appearance of simple monstrosities, but upon farther advance this appearance gradually departed, and, step by step, as the visitor moved his station in the chamber, he saw himself surrounded by an endless succession of the ghastly forms which belonged to the superstition of the Norman, or arise in the guilty slumbers of the monk. The phantasmagoric effect was vastly heightened by the artificial introduction of a strong continual current of wind behind the draperies, giving a hideous and uneasy animation to the whole. In halls such as these, in a bridal chamber such as this, I passed, with the Lady of Tremaine. The unhallowed hours of the first month of our marriage passed them with but little disquietude. That my wife dreaded the fierce moodiness of my temper, that she shunned me and loved me but little, I could not help perceiving, but it gave me rather pleasure than otherwise. I loathed her with a hatred belonging more to demon than to man. My memory flew back, oh, with what intensity of regret, to Ligeia, the beloved, the august, the beautiful, the entombed. I revelled in recollections of her purity, of her wisdom, of her lofty, her ethereal nature, of her passionate, idolatrous love. Now, then, did my spirit fully and freely burn with more than all the fires of her own. In the excitement of my opium dreams, for I was habitually fettered in the shackles of the drug, I would call aloud upon her name, during the silence of the night, or among the sheltered recesses of the glens by day, as if through the wild eagerness, the solemn passion, the consuming ardour of my longing for the departed, I could restore her to the pathway she had abandoned. Ah, could it be forever upon the earth? About the commencement of the second month of the marriage, the Lady Rowena was attacked with sudden illness, from which her recovery was slow. The fever, which consumed her, rendered her nights easy, and in her perturbed state of half-slumber, she spoke of sounds and of motions in and about the chamber of the turret, which I concluded had no origin save in the distemper of her fancy, or perhaps in the phantasmagoric influences of the chamber itself. She became at length convalescent, finally well. Yet but a brief period elapsed, ere a second more violent disorder again threw her upon a bed of suffering, and from this attack her frame, at all times feeble, never altogether recovered. Her illnesses were, after this epoch, of alarming character, and of more alarming recurrence, defying alike the knowledge and the great exertions of her physicians. Increase of the chronic disease which had thus, apparently, taken too sure hold upon her constitution to be eradicated by human means, I could not fail to observe a similar increase in the nervous irritation of her temperament, and in her excitability by trivial causes of fear. She spoke again, and now more frequently and pertinaciously, of the sounds, of the slight sounds, and of the unusual motions among the tapestries, to which she had formerly alluded. One night, near the closing in of September, she pressed this distressing subject with more than usual emphasis upon my attention. She had just awakened from an unquiet slumber, and I had been watching, with feelings half of anxiety, half of vague terror, the workings of her emaciated countenance. I sat by the side of her ebony bed, upon one of the ottomans of India. She partly arose and spoke, in an earnest low whisper of sounds which she then heard, but which I could not hear, of motions which she then saw, but which I could not perceive. The wind was rushing hurriedly behind the tapestries, and I wished to show her what, let me confess it, I could not all believe, that those almost inarticulate breathings, and those very gentle variations of the figures upon the wall, were but the natural effects of that customary rushing of the wind. But a deadly pallor, overspreading her face, had proved to me that my exertions to reassure her would be fruitless. She appeared to be fainting, and no attendants were within call. I remember where was deposited a decanter of light wine, which had been ordered by her physicians, and had hastened across the chamber to procure it. But, as I stepped beneath the light of the censer, two circumstances of a startling nature attracted my attention. I had felt that some palpable, although invisible object had passed lightly by my person, and I saw that there lay upon the golden carpet, in the very middle of the rich lustre thrown from the censer, a shadow, a faint, indefinite shadow of angelic aspect, such as might be fancied for the shadow of a shade. But I was wild with the excitement of an immoderate dose of opium, and heeded these things but little, nor spoke of them to Rowena. Having found the wine, I recrossed the chamber and poured out a gobletful which I held to the lips of the fainting lady. She had now partially recovered, however, and took the vessel herself, while I sank upon an ottoman near me, with my eyes fastened upon her person. It was then that I became distinctly aware of a gentle footfall upon the carpet, and near the couch, and in a second thereafter, as Rowena was in the act of raising the wine to her lips, I saw, or may have dreamt that I saw, fall within the goblet, as if from some invisible spring in the atmosphere of the room, 3 or 4 large drops of a brilliant and ruby-coloured fluid. If this I saw, not so Rowena. She swallowed the wine unhesitatingly, and I forbore to speak to her of a circumstance which must, after all, I considered, have been but the suggestion of a vivid imagination, rendered morbidly active by the terror of the lady, by the opium, and by the hour. Yet I cannot conceal it from my own perception that, immediately subsequent to the fall of the ruby drops, a rapid change for the worse took place in the disorder of my wife, so that on the 3rd subsequent night, the hands of her menials prepared her for the tomb, and on the 4th, I sat alone, with her shrouded body, in that fantastic chamber which had received her as my bride. Wild visions, opium engendered, flitted, shadow-like before me. I gazed with unquiet eye upon the sarcophagi, in the angles of the room, upon the varying figures of the drapery, and upon the writhing of the party-coloured fires in the censer overhead. My eyes then fell, as I called to mind the circumstances of a former night, to the spot beneath the glare of the censer where I had seen the faint traces of the shadow. It was there, however, no longer, and breathing with greater freedom, I turned my glances to the pallid and rigid figure upon the bed. Then rushed upon me 1,000 memories of Ligeia, and then came back upon my heart, with the turbulent violence of a flood, the whole of that unutterable woe with which I had regarded her thus enshrouded. The night waned, and still, with a bosom full of bitter thoughts of the one only and supremely beloved, I remained gazing upon the body of Rowena. It might have been midnight, or perhaps earlier or later, for I had taken no note of time, when a sob, low, gentle, but very distinct, startled me from my reverie. I felt that it came from the bed of ebony, the bed of death. I listened in an agony of superstitious terror, but there was no repetition of the sound. I strained my vision to detect any motion in the corpse, but there was not the slightest perceptible. Yet I could not have been deceived. I had heard the noise, however faint, and my soul was awakened within me. I resolutely and perseveringly kept my attention riveted upon the body. Many minutes elapsed before any circumstance occurred tending to throw light upon the mystery.
At length, it became evident that a slight, very feeble, and barely noticeable tinge of colour had flushed up within the cheeks, and along the sunken small veins of the eyelids. Through a species of unutterable horror and awe, for which the language of mortality has no sufficiently energetic expression, I felt my heart cease to beat, my limbs grow rigid where I sat, yet a sense of duty finally operated to restore my self-possession. I could no longer doubt that we had been precipitate in our preparations, that Rowena still lived. It was necessary that some immediate exertion be made, yet the turret was altogether apart from the portion of the abbey tenanted by the servants. There were none within call. I had no means of summoning them to my aid without leaving the room for many minutes, and this I could not venture to do. I therefore struggled alone in my endeavours to call back the spirit ill hovering. In a short period it was certain, however, that a relapse had taken place. The colour disappeared from both eyelid and cheek, leaving a wanness even more than that of marble. The lips became doubly shrivelled and pinched up in the ghastly expression of death. Every pulse of clamminess and coldness overspread rapidly the surface of the body, and all the usual rigorous illness immediately supervened. I fell back with a shudder upon the couch, from which I had been so startlingly aroused, and again gave myself up to passionate waking visions of Ligeia. An hour thus elapsed when, could it be possible, I was a second time aware of some vague sound issuing from the region of the bed. I listened in extremity of horror. The sound came again. It was a sigh. Rushing to the corpse, I distinctly saw, a tremor upon the lips. A minute afterward they relaxed, disclosing a bright line of the pearly teeth. Amazement now struggled in my bosom with the profound awe which had hitherto reigned there alone. I felt that my vision grew dim, that my reason wandered, and it was only by a violent effort that I at length succeeded in nerving myself to the task which duty thus once more had pointed out. There was now a partial glow upon the forehead, and upon the cheek and throat. A perceptible warmth pervaded the whole frame. There was even a slight pulsation at the heart. The lady lived, and with redoubled ardour I betook myself to the task of restoration. I chafed and bathed the temples and the hands, and used every exertion which experience and no little medical reading could suggest, but in vain. Suddenly the colour fled, the pulsation ceased, the lips resumed the expression of the dead, and in an instant afterward the whole body took upon itself the icy chilliness, the livid hue, the intense rigidity, the sunken outline, and all the loathsome peculiarities of that which has been, for many days, a tenant of the tomb. And again I sunk into visions of Ligeia, and again, what marvel that I shudder while I write, again there reached my ears a low sob from the region of the ebony bed. But why shall I minutely detail the unspeakable horrors of that night? Why shall I pause to relate how, time after time, until near the period of the grey dawn, this hideous drama of revivification was repeated? How each terrific relapse was only into a sterner and apparently more irredeemable death? How each agony wore the aspect of a struggle with some invisible foe? And how each struggle was succeeded by I know not what of wild change in the personal appearance of the corpse? Let me hurry to a conclusion. The greater part of the fearful night had worn away, and she who had been dead once again stirred, and now more vigorously than hitherto, although arousing from a dissolution more appalling in its utter hopelessness than any. I had long ceased to struggle or to move, and remained sitting rigidly upon the ottoman, a helpless prey to a whirl of violent emotions, of which extreme awe was perhaps the least terrible, the least consuming. The corpse, I repeat, stirred, and now more vigorously than before. The hues of life flushed up and unwanted energy into the countenance. The limbs relaxed, and, save that the eyelids were yet pressed heavily together, and that the bandages and draperies of the grave still imparted their charnel character to the figure, I might have dreamt that Rowena had indeed shaken off, utterly, the fetters of death. But if this idea was not, even then, altogether adopted, I could at least doubt no longer, when, arising from the bed, tottering, with feeble steps, with closed eyes, and with the manner of one bewildered in a dream, the thing that was enshrouded advanced boldly and palpably into the middle of the apartment. I trembled not, I stirred not, for a crowd of unutterable fancies connected with the air, the stature, the demeanour of the figure, rushing hurriedly through my brain, had paralyzed, had chilled me into stone. I stirred not, but gazed upon the apparition. There was a mad disorder in my thoughts, a tumult unappeasable. Could it indeed be the living Rowena who confronted me? Could it indeed be Rowena at all? The fair-haired, the blue-eyed Lady Rowena, Trevanion of Tremaine. Why should I doubt it? The bandage lay heavily about the mouth. But then might it not be the mouth of the breathing Lady of Tremaine? And the cheeks, there were the roses as in her noon of life. Yes, these might indeed be the fair cheeks of the living Lady of Tremaine. And the chin, with its dimples as in health, might it not be hers? But has she then grown taller since her malady? What inexpressible madness seized me with that thought! One bound and I had reached her feet. Shrinking from my touch, she let fall from her head, unloosened the ghastly cerements which had confined it, and there streamed forth, into the rushing atmosphere of the chamber, huge masses of long and dishevelled hair. It was blacker than the raven wings of the midnight. And now, slowly opened the eyes of the figure which stood before me. Here then at last, I shrieked aloud. Can I never be mistaken? These are the full and the black and the wild eyes of my lost love, of the Lady Ligeia. You have been listening to Ligeia by Edgar Allan Poe. Some tales conclude, others linger, like perfume in an abandoned chamber or a gaze felt long after one is certain they are alone. Was this resurrection, delirium, under the influence of opium, fevered dream of a mind undone by grief? Poe offers no comfort. He rarely does. Instead, he leaves us with a whisper that the will may be stronger than the flesh, and perhaps more dangerous. Until our next installment of Timeless Terrors, remember, guard your thoughts carefully. Not all of them are entirely your own. Good night. This has been Ligeia, written by Edgar Allan Poe, narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year publication 1838. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright 2026. Jonathan Dunne. Welcome back to Timeless Terrors, number 126. Tonight for you we have a short little piece called De Passeur, by Robert W. Chambers, the same author of the story In the Court of the Dragon, which featured right here with us just a few days ago. Before we begin, may I ask you something? As you arrived here tonight, wherever here may be, did you notice whether you were followed? Not by footsteps, not by anything so obvious, but by a presence, a feeling that something crossed with you. Tonight's story is about crossings and strange crossovers, about that delicate moment when one state becomes another, and whether anyone stands waiting on the threshold. A passeur is a ferryman, one who guides travelers from one shore to the next, but it is not always clear who summoned him, or whether the traveler understands the journey has already begun. And remember, the next time you cross over a threshold, you might just give a glance down and question, what if? Let us proceed carefully. The Passeur, written by Robert W. Chambers. Original year of publication, 1897. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2026, Jonathan Dunne. Because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets. Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, verse 5. The King James Bible. When he had finished his pipe, he tapped the briar bowl against the chimney until the ashes powdered the charred logs smouldering across the andirons. Then he sank back in his chair, absently touching the hot pipe bowl with the tip of each finger until it grew cool enough to be dropped into his coat pocket. Twice he raised his eyes to the little American clock ticking upon the mantel. He had half an hour to wait. The 3 candles that lighted the room might be trimmed to advantage. This would give him something to do. A pair of scissors lay open upon the bureau, and he rose and picked them up. For a while he stood dreamily shutting and opening the scissors, his eyes roaming about the room. There was an easel in the corner, and a pile of dusty canvases behind it. Behind the canvases there was a shadow, that grey, menacing shadow that never moved. When he had trimmed each candle, he wiped the smoky scissors on a paint rag and flung them on the bureau again. The clock pointed to 10. He had been occupied exactly 3 minutes. The bureau was littered with neckties, pipes, combs and brushes, matches, reels and flybooks, collars, shirt studs and a new pair of Scotch shooting stockings and a woman's work basket. He picked out all the neckties, folded them once and hung them over a bit of twine that stretched across the looking-glass. The shirt studs he shoveled into the top drawer along with brushes, combs and stockings. The reels and flybooks he dusted with his handkerchief and placed methodically along the mantel shelf. Twice he stretched out his hand toward the woman's work basket, but his hand fell to his side again, and he turned away into the room staring at the dying fire. Outside the snow-sealed window, a shutter broke loose and banged monotonously until he flung open the panes and fastened them. The soft, wet snow that had choked the window panes all day was frozen hard now, and he had to break the polished crust before he could find the rusty shutter hinge. He leaned out for a moment, his numbed hands resting on the snow, the roar of a rising snow squall in his ears. And out across the desolate garden and stark hedgerow he saw the flat black river spreading through the gloom. A candle sputtered and snapped behind him. A sheet of drawing paper fluttered across the floor, and he closed the panes and turned back into the room, both hands in his worn pockets. The little American clock on the mantel ticked and ticked, but the hands lagged, for he had not been occupied 5 minutes in all. He went up to the mantel and watched the hands of the clock. A minute longer than a year to him, crept by. Around the room the furniture stood ranged. A chair or two of yellow pine, a table, the easel, and in one corner the broad curtained bed, and behind each lay shadows, menacing shadows that never moved. A little pale flame started up from the smoking log on the andirons. The room sang with the sudden hiss of escaping wood gases. After a little, the back of the log caught fire. Jets of blue flared up here and there with mellow sounds like the lighting of gas burners in a row. And in a moment a thin sheet of yellow flame wrapped the whole charred log. Then the shadows moved. Not the shadows behind the furniture, they never moved, but other shadows, thin, grey, confusing, that came and spread their slim patterns all around him, and trembled, and trembled. He dared not step or tread upon them. They were too real. They meshed the floor around his feet. They ensnared his knees. They fell across his breast like ropes. Some night, in the silence of the moors, when wind and river were still, he feared these strands of shadow might tighten, creep higher around his throat and tighten. But even then he knew that those other shadows would never move, those grey shapes that knelt crouching in every corner. When he looked up at the clock again, 10 minutes had straggled past. Time was disturbed in the room. The strands of shadow seemed entangled among the hands of the clock, dragging them back from their rotation. He wondered if the shadows would strangle time, some still night when the wind and the flat river were silent. There grew a sudden chill across the floor. The cracks of the boards let it in. He leaned down and drew his sabots toward him from their place near the andirons, and slipped them over his chaussons. And as he straightened up, his eyes mechanically sought the mantel above, where in the desk another pair of sabots stood. Little, slender, delicate sabots, carved from red beech. A year's dust grayed their surface. A year's rust dulled the silver band across the instep. He said this to himself aloud, knowing that it was within a few minutes of the year. His own sabots came from Mort Dieu. They were shaved square and banded with steel. But in days past he had thought that no sabot in Mort Dieu was delicate enough to touch the instep of the Mort Dieu Passeur. So he sent to the shore lighthouse, and they sent to Lorient, where the women are coquettish, and show their hair under the coif, and wear dainty sabots, and in this town where vanity corrupts, and there is much lace on coiffure and collerette, a pair of delicate sabots was found, banded with silver and chiseled in red beech, stood on the mantel above the fire now, dusty, untarnished. There was a sound from the window, the soft murmur of snow blotting glass panes. The wind, too, muttered under the roof eaves. Presently it would begin to whisper to him from the chimney. He knew it. And he held his hands over his ears and stared at the clock. In the hamlet of Mort Dieu, the pines sing all day of the sea secrets. But in the night the ghosts of little grey birds fill the branches, singing of the sunshine of past years. He heard the song as he sat, and he crushed his hands over his ears. But the grey birds joined with the wind in the chimney, and he heard all that he dared not hear, and he thought all that he dared not hope or think, and the swift tears scalded his eyes. In Mort Dieu the nights are longer than anywhere on earth. He knew it. Why should he not know? This had been so for a year. It was different before. There were so many things different before. Days and nights vanished like minutes then. The pines told no secrets of the sea, and the grey birds had not yet come to Mort Dieu. Also, there was Jeanne, Passeur at the Carmes. When he first saw her, she was poling the square, flat-bottomed ferry skiff from the Carmes to Mort Dieu. A red handkerchief bound across her silky black hair, a red skirt fluttering just below her knees. The next time he saw her, he had to call to her across the placid river. "Away! Away, Passeur!" She came, poling the flat skiff, her deep blue eyes fixed pensively on him, the scarlet skirt and kerchief idly flapping in the April wind. Then day followed day when the far call, "Passeur!" grew clearer and more joyous, and the faint answering cry, "I come!" rippled across the water like music tinged with laughter. Then spring came, and with spring came love. Love carried free across the ferry from the Carmes to Mort Dieu. The flame above the charred log whistled, flickered, and went out in a jet of wood vapor, only to play like lightning above the gas and relight again. The clock ticked more loudly, and the song from the pines filled the room. But in his straining eyes a summer landscape was reflected, where white clouds sailed and white foam curled under the square bow of a little skiff. And he pressed his numbed hands tighter to his ears to drown the cry. "Passeur! Passeur! Passeur!" And now for a moment the clock ceased ticking. It was time to go. Who but he should know it? He who went out into the night swinging his lantern. And he went. He had gone each night from the first. From that first strange winter evening when a strange voice had answered him across the river, the voice of the new Passeur. He had never heard her voice again. So he passed down the windy wooden stairs, lantern hanging lighted in his hand, and stepped out into the storm. Through sheets of drifting snow, over heaps of frozen seaweed and icy drift he moved, shifting his lantern right and left, until its glimmer on the water warned him. Then he called out into the night. "Passeur!" The frozen spray spattered his face and crusted the lantern. He heard the distant boom of breakers beyond the bar, and the noise of mighty winds among the seaward cliffs. "Passeur!" Across the broad flat river, black as a sea of pitch, a tiny light sparkled a moment, and he cried, "Passeur! I come!" He turned ghastly white, for it was her voice. Or was he crazy? And he sprang waist deep into the icy current and cried out again. But his voice ended in a sob. Slowly through the snow the flat skiff took shape, creeping nearer and nearer. But she was not at the pole. He saw that. There was only a tall, thin man, shrouded to the eyes in oilskin. And he leapt into the boat and bade the ferryman hasten. Halfway across, he rose in the skiff and called, "Jean! Jean!" But the roar of the storm and the thrashing of icy waves drowned his voice. Yet he heard her again, and she called to him by name. When at last the boat grated upon the invisible shore, he lifted his lantern, trembling, stumbling among the rocks, and calling to her, as though his voice could silence the voice that had spoken a year ago that night. And it could not. He sank shivering upon his knees, and looked out into the darkness, where an ocean rolled across a world. Then his stiff lips moved, and he repeated her name. But the hand of the ferryman fell gently upon his head. When he raised his eyes, he saw that the ferryman was Death. Crossings are rarely dramatic. There is no thunderclap, no grand announcement, only a quiet understanding that something has changed and cannot be restored. Perhaps you felt it. That subtle shift beneath the story, that sense that a guide stood nearby, patient and watchful. If so, do not be troubled. Every soul must cross eventually. And we hope for a smooth passage, let me tell you. When your ferryman or ferrywoman appears, will you recognize him or her? Until next time, tread lightly. Some shores are closer than they seem. Good night. This has been The Passeur, written by Robert W. Chambers, narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication, 1897. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2026, Jonathan Dunne. Welcome, brave listener, to Timeless Terrors, series number 112. Tonight we delve into our second story by the master of horror, Robert Bloch, The Shambler from the Stars. A tale that stands amongst the darkest and most tense I've had the pleasure of narrating. I invite you to sit close, perhaps with the lights dimmed, for what you're about to hear is no ordinary tale. And by the way, I've been noticing shadows lately, in places where there shouldn't be any. If you happen to spot one, don't worry. They're here for me. Probably. The Shambler from the Stars, written by Robert Bloch, narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication, 1935. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2026, Jonathan Dunne. I am what I profess to be, a writer of weird fiction. Since earliest childhood I have been enthralled by the cryptic fascination of the unknown and the unguessable. The nameless fears, the grotesque dreams, the queer, half-intuitive fancies that haunt our minds have always exercised for me a potent and inexplicable delight. In literature I've walked the midnight paths with Poe or crept amidst the shadows with Machen, combed the realms of horrific stars with Baudelaire, or steeped myself with earth's inner madness amidst the tales of ancient lore. A meagre talent for searching and crayon work led me to attempt crude picturizations involving the outlandish denizens of my nighted thoughts. The same somber trend of intellect which drew me in my art interested me in obscure realms of musical composition. The symphonic strains of the Planet's Suite and the like were my favorites. My inner life soon became a ghoulish feast of eldritch, tantalizing horrors. My outer existence was comparatively dull. As time went on, I found myself drifting more and more into the life of a penurious recluse, a tranquil philosophical existence amidst a world of books and dreams. A man must live, by nature constitutionally and spiritually unfitted for manual labor, I was at first puzzled about the choice of a suitable vocation. The depression complicated matters to an almost intolerable degree, and for a time I was close to utter economic disaster. It was then that I decided to write. I procured a battered typewriter, a ream of cheap paper, and a few carbons. My subject matter did not bother me. What better field than the boundless realms of a colourful imagination? I would write of horror, fear, and the riddle that is death. At least in the callousness of my unsophistication, this was my intention. My first attempt soon convinced me how utterly I had failed. Sadly, miserably. I fell short of my aspired goal. My vivid dreams became, on paper, merely meaningless jumbles of ponderous adjectives, and I found no ordinary words to express the wondrous terror of the unknown. My first manuscripts were miserable and futile documents, the few magazines using such material being unanimous in their rejections. I had to live. Slowly but surely I began to adjust my style to my ideas. Laboriously I experimented with words, phrases, sentence structure. It was work, and hard work at that. I soon learned to sweat. At last, however, one of my stories met with favour. Then a second, a third, a fourth. Soon I had begun to master the more obvious tricks of the trade, and the future looked brighter at last. It was with an easier mind that I returned to my dream life and my beloved books. My stories afforded me a somewhat meagre livelihood, and for a time this sufficed, but not for long. Ambition, ever an illusion, was the cause of my undoing. I wanted to write a real story, not the stereotyped, ephemeral sort of tale I turned out for the magazines, but a real work of art. The creation of such a masterpiece became my ideal. I was not a good writer, but that was not entirely due to my errors in mechanical style. It was, I felt, the fault of my subject matter. Vampires, werewolves, ghouls, mythological monsters. These things constituted material of little merit. Commonplace imagery, ordinary adjectival treatment, and a prosaically anthropocentric point of view were the chief detriments to the production of a really good weird tale. I must have new subject matter, truly unusual plot material. If only I could conceive of something that was teratologically incredible. I longed to learn the songs the demons sing as they swoop between the stars, or hear the voices of the olden gods as they whisper their secrets to the echoing void. I yearned to know the terrors of the grave, the kiss of maggots on my tongue, the cold caress of a rotting shroud upon my body. I thirsted for the knowledge that lies in the pits of mummified eyes, and burned for wisdom known only to the worm. Then I could really write, and my hopes be truly realized. I sought a way. Quietly, I began a correspondence with isolated thinkers and dreamers all over the country. There was a hermit in the western hills, a savant in the northern wilds, a mystic dreamer in New England. It was from the latter that I learned of the ancient books that hold strange lore. He quoted guardedly from the legendary Necronomicon, and spoke timidly of a certain book of Abon that was reputed to surpass it in the utter wildness of its blasphemy. He himself had been a student of these volumes of primal dread, but he did not want me to search too far. He had heard many strange things as a boy in witch-haunted Arkham, where the old shadows still leer and creep, and since then he had wisely shunned the blacker knowledge of the forbidden. At length, after much pressing on my part, he reluctantly consented to furnish me with the names of certain persons he deemed able to aid me in my quest. He was a writer of notable brilliance and wide reputation among the discriminating few, and I knew he was keenly interested in the outcome of the whole affair. As soon as his precious list came into my possession, I began a widespread postal campaign in order to obtain access to the desired volumes. My letters went out to the universities, private libraries, reputed seers, and the leaders of carefully hidden and obscurely designated cults. But I was foredoomed to disappointment. The replies I received were definitely unfriendly, almost hostile.
Evidently the rumored possessors of such lore were angered that their secret should be thus unveiled by a prying stranger. I was subsequently the recipient of several anonymous threats through the mails, and I had one very alarming phone call. This did not bother me nearly so much as the disappointing realization that my endeavors had failed. Denials, evasions, refusals, threats, these would not aid me. I must look elsewhere. The bookstores. Perhaps on some musty and forgotten shelf, I might discover what I sought. Then I began an interminable crusade. I learned to bear my numerous disappointments with unflinching calm. Nobody in the common run of shops seemed ever to have heard of the frightful Necronomicon, the evil Book of Abon, or the disquieting Culte de Goulet. Persistence brings results. In a little old shop on South Dearborn Street, amidst dusty shelves seemingly forgotten by time, I came to the end of my search. There, securely wedged between 2-century-old editions of Shakespeare, stood a great black volume with iron facings. Upon it, in hand-graved lettering, was the inscription De Vermis Mysteriis, or Mysteries of the Worm. The proprietor could not tell how it had come into his possession. Years before, perhaps, it had been included in some second-hand job lot. He was obviously unaware of its nature, for I purchased it with a $1 bill. He wrapped the ponderous thing for me, well pleased at this unexpected sale, and bade me a very satisfied good day. I left hurriedly, the precious prize under my arm. What a find! I had heard of this book before. Ludwig Prynne was its author, who had perished at the inquisitorial stake in Brussels when the witchcraft trials were at their height. A strange character, alchemist, necromancer, reputed mage, he boasted of having attained a miraculous age when he, at last, suffered a fiery immolation at the hands of the secular arm. He was said to have proclaimed himself the sole survivor of the ill-fated Ninth Crusade, exhibiting as proof certain musty documents of attestation. It is true that a certain Ludwig Prynne was numbered among the gentlemen retainers of Montserrat in the olden chronicles, but the incredulous branded Ludwig as a crack-brained impostor, though perchance a lineal descendant of the original warrior. Ludwig attributed his sorcerous learning to the years he had spent as a captive among the wizards and wonder-workers of Syria, and glibly he spoke of encounters with the jinns and efreets of elder Eastern myth. He is known to have spent some time in Egypt, and there are legends among the Libyan dervishes concerning the old seer's deeds in Alexandria. At any rate, his declining days were spent in the Flemish lowland country of his birth, where he resided, appropriately enough, in the ruins of a pre-Roman tomb that stood in the forest near Brussels. Ludwig was reputed to have dwelt there amidst a swarm of familiars and fearsomely invoked conjurations. Manuscripts still extant speak of him guardedly as being attended by invisible companions and star-sent servants. Peasants shunned the forest by night, for they did not like certain noises that resounded to the moon, and they most certainly were not anxious to see what worshipped at the old pagan altars that stood crumbling in certain of the darker glens. Be that as it may, these creatures that he commanded were never seen after Prynne's capture by the inquisitorial minions. Searching soldiers found the tomb entirely deserted, though it was thoroughly ransacked before its destruction. The supernatural entities, the unusual instruments and compounds, all had most curiously vanished. A search of the forbidding woods and a timorous examination of the strange altars did not add to the information. There were fresh bloodstains on the altars, and fresh bloodstains on the rack too, before the questioning of Prynne was finished. A series of particularly atrocious tortures failed to elicit any further disclosures from the silent wizard, and at length the weary interrogator ceased, and cast the aged sorcerer into a dungeon. It was in prison, while awaiting trial, that he penned the morbid, horror-hinting lines of De Vermis Mysteriis, known today as Mysteries of the Worm. How it was ever smuggled through the alert guards is a mystery in itself, but a year after his death it saw print in Cologne,
It was immediately suppressed, but a few copies had already been privately distributed. These in turn were transcribed, and although there was a later censored and deleted printing, only the Latin original is accepted as genuine. Throughout the centuries, a few of the elect have read and pondered on its lore. The secrets of the old archimage are known today only to the initiated, and they discourage all attempts to spread their fame for certain very definite reasons. This, in brief, was what I knew of the volume's history at the time it came into my possession. As a collector's item alone, the book was a phenomenal find, but on its contents I could pass no judgment. It was in Latin. Since I can speak or translate only a few words of that learned tongue, I was confronted by a barrier as soon as I opened the musty pages. It was maddening to have such a treasure trove of dark knowledge at my command, and yet lacked the key to its unearthing. For a moment I despaired, since I was unwilling to approach any local classical or Latin scholar in connection with so hideous and blasphemous a text. Then came on an inspiration. Why not take it east and seek the aid of my friend? He was a student of the classics, and would be less likely to be shocked by the horrors of Prynne's baleful revelations. Accordingly, I addressed a hasty letter to him, and shortly thereafter received my reply. He would be glad to assist me. I must by all means come at once. Two. Providence is a lovely town. My friend's house was ancient and quaintly Georgian. The first floor was a gem of colonial atmosphere. The second, beneath the antique gables that shadowed the enormous window, served as a workroom for my host. It was here that we pondered that grim, eventful night last April. Here, beside the open window that overlooked the azure sea. It was a moonless night, haggard and worn with a fog that filled the darkness with bat-like shadows. In my mind's eye I can see it still. The tiny lamplit room with the big table and the high-backed chairs, the bookcases bordering the walls, the manuscripts stacked in special files. My friend and I sat at the table, the volume of mystery before us. His lean profile threw a disturbing shadow on the wall, and his waxen face was furtive in the pale light. There was an inexplicable air of portentous revelation quite disturbing in its potency. I sensed the presence of secrets waiting to be revealed. My companion detected it too. Long years of occult experience had sharpened his intuition to an uncanny degree. It was not cold that made him tremble as he sat there in his chair. It was not fever that caused his eyes to flame like jewel-incarned fires. He knew, even before he opened that accursed tome, that it was evil. The musty scent that rose from those antique pages carried with it the reek of the tomb. The faded leaves were maggoty at the edges, and rats had gnawed the leather. Rats which perchance had a ghastlier food for common fare. I had told my friend the volume's history that afternoon, and had unwrapped it in his presence. Then he had seemed willing and eager to begin an immediate translation. Now he demurred. It was not wise, he insisted. This was evil knowledge. Who could say what demon-dreaded lore these pages might contain, or what ills befell the ignorant one who sought to tamper with their contents? It is not good to learn too much, and men had died for exercising the rotted wisdom that these leaves contained. He begged me to abandon the quest while the book was still unopened, and to seek my inspiration in saner things. I was a fool. Hastily I overruled his objections with vain and empty words. I was not afraid. Let us at least gaze into the contents of our prize. I began to turn the pages. The result was disappointing. It was an ordinary-looking volume after all. Yellow, crumbling leaves set with heavy black-lettered Latin texts. That was all. No illustrations, no alarming designs. My friend could no longer resist the allurement of such a rare bibliophilic treat. In a moment he was peering intently over my shoulder, occasionally muttering snatches of Latin phrasing. Enthusiasm mastered him at last. Seizing the precious tome in both hands, he seated himself near the window and began reading paragraphs at random, occasionally translating them into English. His eyes gleamed with a feral light. His cadaverous profile grew intent as he pored over the mouldering runes.
Sentences turned in fearsome litany, then faded into tones below a whisper as his voice became as soft as a viper's hiss. I caught only a few phrases now, for in his introspection he seemed to have forgotten me. He was reading of spells and enchantments. I recall allusions to such gods of divinations as Father Yig, Dark Han, and serpent-bearded Biatus. I shuddered, for I knew these names of old, but I would have shuddered more had I known what was yet to come. It came quickly. Suddenly he turned to me in great agitation, and his excited voice was shrill. He asked me if I remembered the legends of Prince Sorcery, and the tales of the invisible servants he commanded from the stars. I assented, little understanding the cause of his sudden frenzy. Then he told me the reason. Here, under a chapter on familiars, he had found an orison or spell, perhaps the very one Prynne had used to call upon his unseen servitors from beyond the stars. Let me listen while he read. I sat there dully, like a stupid, uncomprehending fool. Why did I not scream, try to escape, or tear that monstrous manuscript from his hands? Instead, I sat there while my friend, in a voice cracked with unnatural excitement, read in Latin a long and sonorously sinister invocation. Tibi, 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 magnum, 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 innominando, siga, 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 stellarum, stellarum, ligaro, ligaro, et, buffoniformis, saduque, sigillo, 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 sigillo. The croaking ritual proceeded, then rose on wings of nighted hideous horror. The words seemed to ride like flames in the air, burning into my brain. The thundering tones cast an echo into infinity, beyond the farthermost star. They seemed to pass into primal and undimensioned gates, to seek out a listener there and summon him to earth. Was it all an illusion? I did not pause to ponder, for that unwitting summons was answered. Scarcely had my companion's voice died away in that little room before the terror came. The room turned cold. A sudden wind shrieked in through the open window, a wind that was not of earth. It bore an evil bleating from afar, and at the sound my friend's face became a pale white mask of newly awakened fear. Then there was a crunching at the walls, and the window ledge buckled before my staring eyes. From out of the nothingness, beyond that opening, came a sudden burst of lubricious laughter, a hysterical cackling born of utter madness. It rose to the grinning quintessence of all horror without mouth to give it birth. The rest happened with startling swiftness. All at once my friend began to scream as he stood by the window, scream and claw wildly at empty air. In the lamplight I saw his features contort into a grimace of insane agony. A moment later his body rose unsupported from the floor and began to bend outward to a back-breaking degree. A second later came the sickening grind of broken bones. His form now hung in mid-air, the eyes glazed and the hands clutching convulsively as if at something unseen. Once again there came the sound of maniacal tittering. This time it came from within the room. The stars rocked in red anguish. The cold wind gibbered in my ears. I crouched in my chair, my eyes riveted on that astounding scene in the corner. My friend was shrieking now. His screams blended with that gleeful, atrocious laughter from the empty air. His sagging body, dangling in space, bent backward once again as blood spurted from the torn neck, spraying like a ruby fountain. That blood never reached the floor. It stopped in midair as the laughter ceased, and a loathsome sucking noise took its place. With a new and accelerated horror, I realized that the blood was being drained to feed the invisible entity from beyond. What creature of space had been so suddenly and unwittingly invoked? What was that vampiric monstrosity I could not see? Even now a hideous metamorphosis was taking place. The body of my companion became shrunken, wizened, lifeless. At length it dropped to the floor and lay nauseatingly still. But in mid-air another and a ghastlier change occurred.
reddish glow filled the corner by the window, a bloody glow. Slowly but surely, the dim outlines of a presence came into view. The blood-filled outlines of that unseen Shambler from the stars. It was red and dripping, an immensity of pulsing, moving jelly, a scarlet blob with myriad tentacular trunks that waved and waved. There were suckers on the tips of the appendages, and these were opening and closing with a ghoulish lust. The thing was bloated and obscene, a headless, faceless, eyeless bulk with the ravenous maw and titanic talons of a star-born monster. The human blood on which it had fed revealed the hitherto invisible outlines of the feaster. It was not a sight for sane eyes to see. Fortunately for my reason, the creature did not linger. Spurning the dead and flabby corpse-like thing on the floor, it purposely seized the opening. There, it disappeared, and I heard its far-off derisive laughter floating on the wings of the wind as it receded into the gulfs from whence it had come. That was all. I was left alone in the room with the limp and lifeless body at my feet. The book was gone, but there were bloody prints upon the wall, bloody swathes upon the floor, and the face of my poor friend was a bloody death's head leering up at the stars. For a long time I sat alone in silence, before I set to fire that room and all it contained. After that I went away, laughing, for I knew that the blaze would eradicate all trace of what remained. I had arrived only at that afternoon, and there was none who knew, and none to see me go, for I departed ere the glowing flames were detected. I stumbled for hours through the twisted streets, and quaked with renewed and idiotic laughter as I looked up at the burning, ever-gloating stars that eyed me furtively through wreaths of haunted fog. After a long while I became calm enough to board a train. I have been calm throughout the long journey home, and calm throughout the penning of this screed. I was even calm when I read of my friend's curious accidental death in the fire that destroyed his dwelling. It is only at nights, when the stars gleam, that dreams return to drive me into a gigantic maze of frantic fears. Then I take to drugs, in a vain attempt to ban those leering memories from my sleep. But I really do not care, for I shall not be here long. I have a curious suspicion that I shall again see that Shambler from the stars. I think it will return soon without being resummoned, and I know that when it comes it will seek me out and carry me down into the darkness that holds my friend. Sometimes I almost yearn for the advent of that day, for then I shall learn once and for all the mysteries of the worm.
Ah, you're still here, I see. You've survived the Shambler from the stars. I'll be moving on, keeping one eye over my shoulder as always, though I can't say who or what is still watching. Until next time, stay curious, but cautious, for the world of timeless terrors has a way of following those who listen too closely. Be good. Good night. This has been The Shambler from the Stars, written by Robert Bloch, narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication 1935. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright 2026. Jonathan Dunne. Ah, there you are. Come in. That's it. Close the door behind you. You made good time. I was beginning to think the road might have delayed you. Strange roads, the ones that lead here. They don't always bring who or what you expect. Sit by the fire, that's it. Pull up your chair, that's it. Warm the soles of your feet. You know, on a night like this, I can't help but think of Lord Dunsany. He grew up in Ireland, not unlike myself.
and had the sort of imagination that saw visitors where most men saw only space. Again, not unlike myself. Have you ever heard of The Guest? It's a peculiar tale of a man who dined in an ornate London restaurant, not with a companion he could see, but with a presence he spoke to, as if it were sitting right across the table, an empty chair, and yet a guest, nonetheless. And now here we are, Timeless Terrors number 100. A milestone like that deserves a little brevity and a dash of levity to lighten this dark world we live in. And I would like to personally thank everyone who has come here to visit me on these cold, dark nights, to listen to these old, terrifying gems that provided the footprints and fingerprints of the dark fiction we have today. Now, I'll shut my mouth. I won't say any more. Oh, and by the way, if you should hear a knock on the door, just pay no attention to it. It'll go away by itself. Bon appetit. The Guest, written by Lord Dunsany. Narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication, 1912. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2026. Jonathan Dunne. A young man came into an ornate restaurant at 8 o'clock in London. He was alone, but 2 places had been laid at the table, which was reserved for him. He had chosen the dinner very carefully, by letter, a week before. A waiter asked him about the other guest. "You probably won't see him till the coffee comes," the young man told him. So he was served alone. Those at adjacent tables might have noticed the young man continually addressing the empty chair, and carrying on a monologue with it throughout his elaborate dinner. "I think you knew my father," he said to it over the soup. "I sent for you this evening," he continued, "because I want you to do me a good turn. In fact, I must insist on it." There was nothing eccentric about the man except for this habit of addressing an empty chair. Certainly he was eating as good a dinner as any man could wish for. After the burgundy had been served, he became more voluble in his monologue. Not that he spoiled his wine by drinking excessively. "We have several acquaintances in common," he said. "I met King Seti a year ago in Thebes. I think he has altered very little since you knew him. I thought his forehead a little low for a king's. Cheops has left the house that he built for your reception. He must have prepared for you for years and years. I suppose you have seldom been entertained like that. I ordered this dinner over a week ago. I thought then that a lady might have come with me, but as she wouldn't have asked you, she may not after all be as lovely as Helen of Troy. Was Helen very lovely? Not when you knew her, perhaps. You were lucky in Cleopatra. You must have known her when she was in her prime. You never knew the mermaids, nor the fairies, nor the lovely goddesses of long ago. That's where we have the best of you." He was silent when the waiters came to his table, but rambled merrily on as soon as they left, still turned to the empty chair. "You know, I saw you here in London only the other day. You were on a motor bus going down Ludgate Hill. It was going much too fast. London is a good place, but I shall be glad enough to leave it. It was in London that I met the lady that I was speaking about. If it hadn't been for London, I probably shouldn't have met her. And if it hadn't been for London, she probably wouldn't have had so much besides me to amuse her. It cuts both ways." He paused once to order coffee, gazing earnestly at the waiter and putting a sovereign in his hand. "Don't let it be chicory," said he. The waiter brought the coffee, and the young man dropped a tabloid of some sort into his cup. "I don't suppose you come here very often," he went on. "Well, you probably want to be going. I haven't taken you much out of your way. There is plenty for you to do in London." Then, having drunk his coffee, he fell on the floor by a foot of the empty chair, and the doctor who was dining in the room bent over him and announced to the anxious manager the visible presence of the young man's guest. Well, it's time to leave this table. When you step away tonight, keep your eyes and ears open. One never knows who or what might linger behind a doorway or along the stairs outside. Ah, my little cuckoo bird. Time to fly the nest, my old friend. Till we meet again. And speaking of the coast being clear, I'll bid you good night. Thank you, Mr. Narrator. Just a word from myself, Jonathan. Thank you to each one of you who has supported me on this new venture. Thank you. This has been The Guest, written by Lord Dunsany. Original year of publication, 1912. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2026. Jonathan Dunne. Morella, written by Edgar Allan Poe. Narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication, 1835. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2025. Jonathan Dunne. Itself, by itself, solely, one everlasting and single. Plato. With a feeling of deep, yet most singular affection, I regarded my friend Morella. Thrown by accident into her society many years ago, my soul from our first meeting burned with fires it had never been before known. But the fires were not of Eros, and bitter and tormenting to my spirit was the gradual conviction that I could in no manner define their unusual meaning, or regulate their vague intensity. Yet we met, and fate bound us together at the altar, and I never spoke of passion nor thought of love. She, however, shunned society, and attaching herself to me alone rendered me happy. It is a happiness to wander, it is a happiness to dream. Morella's erudition was profound. As I hoped to live, her talents were of no common order. Her powers of mind were gigantic. I felt this, and in many matters became her pupil. I soon, however, found that, perhaps on account of her Presburg education, she placed before me a number of those mystical writings which are usually considered the mere dross of the early German literature. These, for what reason I could not imagine, were her favourite and constant study, and that in process of time they became my own, should be attributed to the simple but effectual influence of habit and example. In all this, if I err not, my reason had little to do. My convictions, or I forget myself, were in no manner acted upon by the ideal, nor was any tincture of the mysticism which I read to be discovered, unless I am greatly mistaken, either in my deeds or in my thoughts. Persuaded of this, I abandoned myself implicitly to the guidance of my wife, and entered with an unflinching heart into the intricacies of her studies. And then, when poring over forbidden pages, I felt a forbidden spirit enkindling within me. Would Morella place her cold hand upon my own, and rake up from the ashes of a dead philosophy some low, singular words, whose strange meaning burned themselves in upon my memory? And then, hour after hour, would I linger by her side, and dwell upon the music of her voice, until at length its melody was tainted with terror, and there fell a shadow upon my soul, and I grew pale, and shuddered inwardly at those two unearthly tones. And thus joy suddenly faded into horror, and the most beautiful became the most hideous, as Hinnon became Gehenna. It is unnecessary to state the exact character of those disquisitions which, growing out of the volumes I have mentioned, formed for so long a time almost the sole conversation of Morella and myself. By the learned in what might be termed theological morality they will be readily conceived, and by the unlearned they would, at all events, be little understood. The wild pantheism of Fichte, the modified Pelagianadia of the Pythagoreans, and above all the doctrines of identity as urged by Schelling, were generally the points of discussion presenting the most of beauty to the imaginative Morella. That identity which is termed personal, Mr. Locke, I think, truly defines to consist in the saneness of rational being. And since by person we understand an intelligent essence having reason, and since there is a consciousness which always accompanies thinking, it is this which makes us all to be that which we call ourselves, thereby distinguishing us from other beings that think, and giving us our personal identity. But the principium individuationis, the notion of that identity which at death is or is not lost forever, was to me at all times a consideration of intense interest, not more from the perplexing and exciting nature of its consequences than from the marked and agitated manner in which Morella mentioned them. But indeed the time had now arrived when the mystery of my wife's manner oppressed me as a spell. I could no longer bear the touch of her wan fingers, nor the low tone of her musical language, nor the lustre of her melancholy eyes. And she knew all this, but did not upbraid. She seemed conscious of my weakness or my folly, and smiling called it fate. She seemed also conscious of a cause, to me unknown, for the gradual alienation of my regard, but she gave me no hint or token of its nature. Yet was she woman, and pined away daily. In time the crimson spot settled steadily upon the cheek, and the blue veins upon the pale forehead became prominent. And one instant my nature melted into pity, but in next I met the glance of her meaning eyes, and then my soul sickened and became giddy, with the giddiness of one who gazes downward into some dreary and unfathomable abyss. Shall I then say that I longed with an earnest and consuming desire for the moment of Morella's decease? I did, but the fragile spirit clung to its tenement of clay for many days, for many weeks and irksome months, until my tortured nerves obtained the mastery over my mind, and I grew furious through delay, and with the heart of a fiend cursed the days and the hours and the bitter moments, which seemed to lengthen and lengthen as her gentle life declined, like shadows in the dying of the day. But one autumnal evening, when the winds lay still in heaven, Morella called me to her bedside. There was a dim mist over all the earth, and a warm glow upon the waters, and amid the rich October leaves of the forest a rainbow from the firmament had surely fallen. "It is a day of days," she said, as I approached. "A day of all days, either to live or die. It is a fair day for the sons of earth and life. Ah, more fair for the daughters of heaven and death." I kissed her forehead, and she continued, "I am dying, yet shall I live. Morella, the days have never been when thou couldst love me, but her whom in life thou didst abhor, in death thou shalt adore. Morella! I repeat that I am dying, but within me is a pledge of that affection, ah, how little, which thou didst feel for me, Morella. And when my spirit departs, shall the child live, thy child and mine, Morella's, but thy days shall be days of sorrow. that sorrow which is the most lasting of impressions, as the cypress is the most enduring of trees. For the hours of thy happiness are over, and joy is not gathered twice in a life, as the roses of Paestum twice in a year. Thou shalt no longer, then, play the Teian with time, but being ignorant of the myrtle and the vine, thou shalt bear about with thee thy shroud on the earth, as do the Moslemen at Mecca. "Morella!" I cried. "Morella! How knowest thou this?" But she turned away, her voice upon the pillow, and a slight tremor coming over her limbs. She thus died, and I heard her voice no more. Yet, as she had foretold, her child, to which in dying she had given birth, which breathed not until the mother breathed no more, her child, a daughter, lived. And she grew strangely in stature and intellect, and was the perfect resemblance of her who had departed. And I loved her with a love more fervent than I had believed it possible to feel for any denizen of earth. But ere long the heaven of this pure affection became darkened, and gloom and horror, and grief swept over it in clouds. I said the child grew strangely in stature and intelligence. Strange indeed was her rapid increase in bodily size, but terrible, oh terrible were the tumultuous thoughts which crowded upon me while watching the development of her mental being. Could it be otherwise when I daily discovered in the conceptions of the child the adult powers and faculties of the woman, when the lessons of experience fell from the lips of infancy, and when the wisdom of the passions of maturity I found hourly gleaming from its full and speculative eye? When, I say, all this became evident to my appalled senses, when I could no longer hide it from my soul, nor throw it off from those perceptions which trembled to receive it, is it to be wondered at that suspicions of a nature fearful and exciting crept in upon my spirit, or that my thoughts fell back aghast upon the wild tales and thrilling theories of the entombed Morella? I snatched from the scrutiny of the world a being whom destiny compelled me to adore, and in the rigorous seclusion of my home watched with an agonizing anxiety over all which concerned the beloved. And as years rolled away, and I gazed day after day upon her holy and mild and eloquent face, and pored over her maturing form, day after day did I discover new points of resemblance in the child to her mother, the melancholy, and the dead. And hourly grew darker these shadows of similitude, and more full and more definite, and more perplexing, and more hideously terrible in their aspect. I could endure, but then they too often looked down into the depths of my soul with Morella's own intense and bewildering meaning. And in the contour of the high forehead, and in the ringlets of the silken hair, and in the worn fingers which buried themselves therein, and in the sad musical tones of her speech, and above all, oh, above all, in the phrases and expressions of the dead on the lips of the loved and the living, I found food for consuming thought and horror for a worm that would not die. Thus passed away 2 lustra of her life, and as yet my daughter remained nameless upon the earth. My child and my love were the designations usually prompted by a father's affection, and the rigid seclusion of her days precluded all other intercourse. Morella's name died with her at her death. Of the mother I had never spoken to the daughter. It was impossible to speak. Indeed, during the brief period of her existence, the latter had received no impressions from the outward world, save such as might have been afforded by the narrow limits of her privacy. But at length the ceremony of baptism presented to my mind, in its unnerved and agitated condition, a present deliverance from the terrors of my destiny. And at the baptismal font I hesitated for a name, and many titles of the wise and beautiful, of old and modern times, of my own and foreign lands, came thronging to my lips with many, many fair titles of the gentle and the happy and the good. What prompted me then to disturb the memory of the buried dead? What demon urged me to breathe that sound, which in its very recollection was wont to make ebb the purple blood in torrents from the temples to the heart? What fiend spoke from the recesses of my soul, when amid those dim aisles and in the silence of the night I whispered within the ears of the holy man the syllables, Morella? What more than fiend convulsed the features of my child, and overspread them with hues of death? As starting at that scarcely audible sound, she turned her glassy eyes from the earth to heaven, and falling prostrate on the black slabs of her ancestral vault, responded, I am here. Distinct, coldly, calmly distinct, fell those few simple sounds within my ear, and thence like molten lead rolled hissingly into my brain. Years may pass away, but the memory of that epoch never. Nor was I indeed ignorant of the flowers and the vine, but the hemlock and the cypress overshadowed me night and day. And I kept no reckoning of time or place, and the stars of my fate faded from heaven, and therefore the earth grew dark, and its figures passed by me like flitting shadows, and among them all I beheld only Morella. The winds of the firmament breathed but one sound within my ears, and the ripples upon the sea murmured evermore, Morella. But she died, and with my own hands I bore her to the tomb. And I laughed with a long and bitter laugh as I found no traces of the first in the charnel where I laid the second, Morella. This has been Morella, written by Edgar Allan Poe. Narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication, 1835. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2025, Jonathan Dunne. This has been Timeless Terrors, Volume 14, performed by Jonathan Dunne. Production and narration copyright, 2026, Jonathan Dunne.